Hello, Phil here from Wings of Pegasus and welcome to another analysis video. If you enjoy this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. On the agenda tonight, we're going back to 1974. We're going to be taking a look at Aerosmith and they're going to be performing Train Kept a Rollin'. So let's get the guys up on screen and see how they get on.
She rather handsome, I kinda look the same. She was pretty from New York City. I'm walking down Meadow Valley over here, and oh, I'm probably just gonna tell her so. So the train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long over here, and oh, I'm probably just gonna tell her. Train, I met a dame, she rather handsome, but kinda looked the same, but she was pretty from New York City. Walking down Meadow Valley over here, and oh, I'm about to just gonna tell her so. So the train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long. Train kept rolling all night long over here, and oh, I'm about to just gonna tell her.
I'm just going to jump in here because there's a lot to look at so far, and Train Kept a Rollin', you might know this from the Yardbirds. They did a cover of this particular track, and check out my video on the Yardbirds if you get a chance, but it was originally released for Aerosmith in 1974, the same year as the performance that we're currently looking at. It was in 1951 that Tiny Bradshaw released this particular song. I've seen people commenting on this particular video and they've said, why didn't Joe play the solo like he did on the recording that they released in 1974? And the simple answer to that is because Joe didn't play it. It was Steve Hunter and Dick Wagner that played the guitar on the released version of this cover. And you can tell here that Joe is very much playing in his own way. He's got such a unique style when he plays, and that's why you can tell the difference between the two versions, because of the way that Joe has such a unique way of navigating those minor pentatonics, and some of the lines that he throws together that just aren't straightforward. They do really come out of left field in terms of what you're expecting to hear and what Joe plays, and that's why he's such a great guitarist because he's got his own sound, his own personality, and that's the hardest thing to get. And I'm not saying that Steve Hunter and Dick Wagner didn't have their own personalities. That's why there is such a difference between the two versions, and people that aren't musical can spot the difference because we've got three great guitar players who all have individual sounds, and therefore we've got different versions of different solos, and people can start to hear the difference. Putting ourselves in Joe Perry's shoes in this performance, it must have been a bit of a nightmare because the band that he's in have just released a song that people are expecting to hear, and it's got extended guitar solos that you didn't play yourself, and you might be thinking that they want to hear these particular lines live, so I'm gonna have to try and learn what these other players did. And something I've mentioned on this channel many times, the hardest thing to do as a guitarist is to try and emulate and copy somebody else's personality and technique on the fretboard, because there are so many tiny details to it. In this case, we've just got Joe playing his own way, and that's always the best way to do it, especially for Aerosmith, and for him to stamp his authority on the lead guitar role, but also give his own personality to this particular performance of this track. I want to put the spotlight on Steven Tyler as well, because he's that natural frontman. Actually, he doesn't sing badly for a drummer, because that's what he started out as when the band formed, and they had two bands that then merged into one, and Steven was playing drums at that point, but then said that he wanted to be the designated frontman and the lead singer. So that's exactly what happened, and he definitely grew into that role because of his confidence on stage and making eye contact with the camera. In this particular performance is having that overall appreciation of the performance, not only for the audience that are there at the time, but the TV audience. And this is something that Aerosmith were experts at, keeping themselves relevant as the times changed. What strikes me about this particular performance is that Steven is leaning into his chest voice just a little bit more, just getting a slightly thicker tone than you might normally be used to hearing from Steven in that range. And the thing about Steven's vocal cords is that ability to suddenly jump up an octave with no perceivable strain. It's just so easy for him to do that, but also to add so much grit at the top of his register there. It is such a unique sound, and that's something that Steven had, and a few other guys did have in the 80s, maybe not so prevalent in the 70s, but it's something that then caught on, and Steven certainly paved the way. A lot of people will be able to associate that with Dream On, because that's one of their tracks where Steven threw his vocal right up there, and he had the ability to add that vocal distortion, so he gets the aggression in there as well. And it's another thing about this performance, the aggressive nature of it. We have got some serious attitude in this performance. It's almost got a punk edge to it. And that's something that would have been around at the time, certainly mid-70s in the UK, but all over the place in terms of that movement that took off. And there's an element to that, maybe towards the late 70s and then 80s, that start to soften the edges a little bit of the sound. The live setup that Aerosmith had as well, having those two guitars, bass, drums, lead vocalist, it's such a thick sound live that you can get because Joe can go off into his solo sections and always be backed up by Brad, and vice versa if they want to work it that way. But in this particular performance in the mix, we can't really hear Brad, unfortunately. It is like we've just got a three-piece almost because of the sound. It must have been something that wasn't quite mixed well on the night. Aerosmith were a bunch of guys that early on took it really seriously because they all moved into the same house. And mentioning Brad, he came along in 1971 and they gigged a lot. They managed to secure a management deal in 1972, and through their manager they performed in front of Columbia Records. The interesting thing about that performance was that the manager had invited Clive Davis to come and watch the gig, and he was the president of Columbia Records at the time. The only problem was that Aerosmith weren't on the bill for the evening that he was coming down to watch. So Aerosmith tried to get on the bill and they had to end up paying the venue to play in front of Clive Davis. But it all worked out really well because they signed a record deal that same year and released their self-titled album in 1973. That album got to number 166 in the charts, and Dream On got to number 59 in the singles chart. And it's interesting where this video is placed in terms of the timeline of Aerosmith, because this was the year before they released Toys in the Attic, and that was a huge breakthrough album for them. We had Sweet Emotion on that album, which was a top 40 hit, and due to the increase in publicity, they re-released Dream On, and it then made it to number 6 in the charts. But we'll get back into that afterwards. Let's resume this video and watch it until the end.
She must have thought I was a real cool jock. Got out the train, looking handsome, looking so good, Jack couldn't let it go. Ooh, just gonna tell it though. So the train kept rolling all night long. 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 Well, the heat and the hoe, but I'm just gonna tell it.
And there we have it. Such great attitude in this track, and it's really interesting to see some early Aerosmith really before they had that massive impact on the music industry. As you guys will know, you can't be one of the biggest selling rock bands of all time, over 150 million records by the way, without having a solid rhythm section, and that is certainly what we get with Aerosmith, because Joey Kramer on drums is so solid throughout this live performance, and also Tom Hamilton on bass has to be so tied in. Those two together set the foundation for everything else that then lays on top, and the vocal and the lead guitar, all of these lead focuses that we have throughout the song need to sit on top of that foundation. It's a shame that Brad's guitar isn't cutting through the mix here, so it gets a little bit lost, because it'd be great to hear that chunky rhythm playing along as well. I think at this time as well, a lot of people were comparing Aerosmith to the Rolling Stones because of appearances, Steven Tyler looking similar, and the fact that they're both rock bands, but Aerosmith certainly went on to prove that they were great musicians in their own right, and they really carved out their own sound. After the success of Toys in the Attic, they also re-released Walk This Way, and that was in 1976, and in early 1977, that track got into the top 10 of the charts. The previous two albums that they had released now re-charted because of this increase in popularity, and in 1976 is when they released their album called Rock, and that went platinum straight off the bat, and that's a massive hit album. So they were touring and doing really well, but unfortunately towards the tail end of the decade, Joe Perry left the band in 1979, and Steven was dealing with his own drug issues at that time, and in 1980 it was reported that at least one gig he'd collapsed on stage and then completed the whole gig from the floor of the stage. He didn't get up. So he was dealing with his own issues in 1980, and that was the same year that he had a motorcycle accident and he was in hospital, and it took him a while to recover from that, which meant that he couldn't do any recording or touring until well into 1981. So once Stephen had recovered in 1981, unfortunately Brad now left the band. They released in 1982 Rock in a Hard Place, and that did pretty well. It got to number 32 in the charts, but they were performing to smaller crowds than they were before. They weren't really as popular. They were used to playing big venues, but now they weren't playing those venues. And Joe came backstage for one of the shows and was reunited with Stephen. And then Stephen said about that meeting that there was the chemistry and the buzz of meeting together. It's like the old days. And I think some of this was due to the fact that Joe had divorced his wife. And maybe some of the reason that Joe left the band was because there was an argument between their wives, and it all kicked off after a show one day. But it just so happened that Joe had divorced and he came back. He was now a free agent, and him and Stephen really hit it off. So the band were back together for the Back in the Saddle tour, and that was in 1984. And a couple of years later, in 1986, was the masterstroke of re-releasing Walk This Way with Run DMC, because it opened them up to a whole new demographic of audience. At this time, music videos were the in thing, and they were so important. You had MTV, and I still know the Aerosmith Run DMC video for that song. And having so much play on television really would have increased their public profile, considering where they were in the mid-70s, late 70s, and then early 80s, on the way down to then get this boost in 1986. It was a masterstroke, and Tim Collins, their manager at the time, said that he could make them into the biggest rock band there is by 1990, but Stephen really had to clean himself up because he had a lot of problems with drugs at this time, and they just had this boost of popularity and exposure with Run DMC. So it was really down to them how big they wanted to get. Tim certainly saw the potential in Aerosmith at that time. So credit to Steven Tyler, because he cleaned himself up, and they released Permanent Vacation in 1987, and that was a monster album that sold 5 million copies, and it was the first album that Steven said they completed when they were sober. And they did a tour with their label mates Guns N' Roses, and that must have been a really difficult tour to be on, because Guns N' Roses were famous for being wild, having wild parties, and maybe having drugs involved. So for Stephen to be around that at that time, he must have been so strong in order just to continue on. Then 1989 is when they released Pump, and that was even bigger than the previous album. Unbelievably, it sold 7 million copies and won a Grammy, and now Aerosmith were all over the place, having their music videos played. They were also appearing on TV shows, so their public profile had really increased to an all-time high. It looked like Tim Collins really knew what he was talking about, because they had 2 huge albums and then released Get a Grip, and that went to number 1 in the album charts, sold over 7 million copies, won 2 Grammys. And this was the time that Aerosmith also appeared in Wayne's World 2. I think the problem with that is that people are going to criticize the band for selling out and just staying in the mainstream, maybe being a little bit more mainstream with the music as well, but they were keeping themselves in the industry, in the public eye, and they were creating great music the whole time, and the production certainly was changing over the years. They really thrived in the 1990s, and in 1997 is when they released 9 Lives, and during that tour, 1998, is where they had another masterstroke, because they recorded the Diane Warren track called I don't want to miss a thing. The year after, in 1999, is when they got their ride at Disney World in Florida, and I just want to explore this theme of staying in the public eye. It's something that Aerosmith did and still do so well, because when they were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2001, they were the only band to still have a song in the chart whilst they're being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Because usually the inductees are bands that have been around and might have stopped recording maybe 15, 20 years earlier, or moderately recently, but not still recording at the time, whereas Aerosmith was still in the charts being inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and that was Jaded, the song that was in the charts at that time. Then another example is computer games and Guitar Hero, because they released a game called Guitar Hero Aerosmith. And if you don't know what it is, it's a game where you have a plastic guitar and you've got buttons on it, and you have to press the buttons that correspond to the buttons you see on the screen that are activated when you're listening to a particular song and listening to a particular guitar solo. So that's what the game was all about. But again, it opened them up to a whole new demographic, and I don't think they could have achieved this any other way other than getting their music on a game like that appeals to young kids and is potentially so addictive to play. But also there was another injection of exposure for Aerosmith when Steven Tyler became a judge on American Idol, and that's something that maybe caused a bit of tension in the band because they didn't know that Steven was going to do this. They only found out about it when they read it in the paper, when they just had this big reveal of who the judges are going to be on that particular year's series. So again, just by being a judge on that show, it meant that the younger generation, and with those kind of shows, really the younger generation, we're talking about teenagers here, and sometimes younger, I think they changed the rules so that you could be under 16 and still enter these singing contests. So it meant that people would now be asking the question, who is Steven Tyler and who is Aerosmith? And they will be listening to the band's songs and listening to Steven. But it's going to be impossible for me to cover everything that Aerosmith have achieved in this video, considering they're one of the biggest rock and roll bands of all time. But Rock and Roll Hall of Famers. In 2013, Joe and Steven were inducted into the Songwriters Hall of Fame as well. They've won 4 Grammys, 150 million albums sold worldwide. Also, Joe and Steven said they were working on new stuff at the beginning of 2019. It's also possible to go and catch an Aerosmith gig right now if you're anywhere near Las Vegas, because they're currently in residence there. They've just added some more dates to that particular residency, and they'll be going up until at least June 2020. So, still out there, still rocking, and just one of the biggest bands of all time. But such a comeback story, really, considering where they were in the late 70s, early 80s, and how their fortunes really turned on not only some really clever placement with their songs and re-releases, but also Steven getting himself clean, which really enabled them to dominate the 1990s in terms of sales, but exposure on TV, because that was such a huge part of the industry back then. But thank you guys so much for suggesting this video for me to take a look at, and keep those suggestions coming in the comments below. Let me know what you guys think, and if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the next one. Rock!